State of emergency.
There were hundreds and hundreds of bodies lining the streets.
I haven't actually figured out how to fire the gun yet.
Report from the World Health Organization showed that the latest vaccination tests have failed.
With the bureaucrats out of power, we can finally take the necessary steps.
No, you haven't given enough instructions, I'm afraid.
To be placed under martial law, all residents are required to report to their designated quarantine. Riots have continued for a third consecutive day, and winter rations are at an all-time low.
A group calling themselves the Fireflies have claimed responsibility for both attacks.
Their public charter calls for the
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Benjamin Thompson from the Microbiology Society here in the UK. I'm joined at the Wellcome Trust by a group of experts. We're going to take a look at The Last of Us and maybe dip a bit into the science behind it and a bit of the sort of sociology behind it as well. How accurate do you think this particular scenario was? So we've learned in the first 15 minutes of this game that everything has gone very bad, very, very fast. Okay? What are your thoughts on how maybe accurate this representation is of what would happen in a terrible situation like that?
One thing I think they capture quite powerfully is the way that order in society is quite fragile, and it's something that struck me particularly between 5 years ago, almost to the day when we had the riots in London. It's the fact that it turned out there are only a few thousand police. You know, you got several million people in London, and it turned out when it pushed came to shove, they were able to get less than 10,000 police on the streets, and you realise that the number of police to number of actual people in the society is so small that if everybody decides to go on at the same time and create problems or order breaks down, then things can go out of control, you know, within minutes, within hours, and it's quite difficult to get that control back again.
I mean, why is it then, do you think, that the game makers love the post-apocalyptic world?
Oh, well, there are many reasons. I mean, the biggest is probably that there aren't so many people around in the post-apocalypse. There are many things that are important to a video game that aren't necessarily linked to the narrative that work with the post-apocalypse. So you can control resources, for example. It lets you have familiar landmarks, present them in a new way, destroyed, overgrown, whatever. Obviously, when we're talking about the opening, there's a lot there that is unrealistic. I will bow to the experts. I think what's important about the way The Last of Us is presenting it is it's trying to give a very personal, ground-level view of how an unfolding pandemic might work.
Were something ever to happen, let's say today or tomorrow, I mean, goodness me, how would it play out, do you think? What would be the first reaction of the emergency services or the government? What do we think we would do?
What, with a pandemic like this?
Well, I mean, let's say a pandemic like this. Why not? Let's go for it. Let's go 10 out of 10 on awfulness rating straight away.
Well, I don't know about
this is 11, not 10.
Really? Okay. All right. 11 out of 10 then in that case. What's the first thing we'd see, do you think, from an infrastructure perspective?
First thing you do is you bring together the Cabinet Cobra Committee. That's the Cabinet Emergency Committee. I'm assuming there must be some kind of protocols for it. We have some things in place, so that part of a project I'm involved in at UCL, together with Public Health England and various other universities, is to create a pandemic early warning system, effectively to do things so that this never happens, so that you have a combination of observing what's happening on Twitter, Facebook, things that are openly available. You're putting together things like receipts from pharmacies, seeing whether there's a rise in people looking for certain sorts of meds, and putting that information with doctors' appointments to work out, well, do we need to start vaccinating more people? So that you can create a dashboard where you can see where the disease is moving, where you need to put resources. So a lot of the game is about ensuring that it doesn't get out of control.
The UK does have a pandemic strategy for things like influenza and for other sort of infectious diseases, and obviously they have various threat levels. So I think a lot of it is about sort of planning as well, because as well as people being sick, you're also going to have people off work, and there's going to be that impact on kind of the workforce and the delivery. So it really, there's a lot of work sort of being done to try and ensure like a whole systems approach.
What would happen in the first instance? Personally, for me, I would be locking the doors, I would be closing the blinds, I would be putting heavy objects in front of the doors and not going out. Trying to look at the television. Obviously, the television's gone out there. What do we know about the sort of any research that's been done on what people tend to do? And what do you think you would do if something like this happened?
I mean, panic.
That seems like the point one would be freak out.
I'm not really the man you want in charge. I think, let's say rather than turning people into raging zombies, we were dealing with a pandemic that was very, very contagious, something like that. You would want to avoid other people. It seems to me quite unnatural in that situation. You'd want to be in the middle of a crowd.
But you're the same as me. You're staying in. You're maybe a single.
More or less, yeah. I'm
bead of sweat in the head.
I'm trying to avoid large crowds.
Yeah.
And we'll see how long I last.
Okay. And what about yourself? What do you think?
Stay in.
Yeah, stay in.
I would definitely be staying in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And me too.
Maybe curfews and isolating people from others to prevent them getting sick. Now, is this an effective way of keeping populations safe? And it's kind of the opposite of maybe a TB hospital. It's the other way around. We're trying to keep the healthy people in and the sick people out, rather than the sick people in and the healthy people out. So, I mean, looking maybe from a historical perspective, is this an effective way of preventing disease?
Certainly in terms of, like, throughout history, there's been lots of isolation, you know, right back to the 1600s when ships would come to Europe bringing cargo. They would have to go through health authorities and be checked for plague and for other infectious diseases. And, you know, even right through to kind of, you know, the Ebola outbreak in the last few years, isolating infected people, you know, is a way of managing a situation like that. So, you know, there's certainly room for elements of that in kind of the management of situations like this.
By the way, that's the most amazing diagnostic test I ever seen.
I know, it's the future
in a
is
few
now.
seconds. Wow.
So this was in 2013, I think, is that
No,
right?
well, that's 2033.
2033, okay.
The start of the game is 2013, and then it skips 20 years.
I want
So
to be inventing that one.
Really? Okay, well, yeah, let's get on that right now, hey.
The fact that it's a fungus, yes, does shock me, because actually up to now I only know of fungus causing disease or causing serious disease and death only with people with a problem with the immune system. So a fragile or non-existent immune system. So in the case of a pandemic that has gone so quickly with a fungus, it's for me it's a strange choice of disease, although the effect of it is a very common effect, I assume.
Yeah.
It's a rabies scenario. The zombie everything, it's always based on rabies. People get mad and they want to bite the others, and then they spread the infection. Classic.
Well, let's throw that over then from the maybe with your sort of game journalist hat and you knowing game makers. Why have they chosen this one, do you think?
You know, their primary consideration here is not whether spores are a realistic vector for spreading. It's whether spores are an interesting visual effect that can make an interesting gameplay section, such as wearing your gas mask and moving slowly through somewhere dark. And then when you see the enemies themselves, they obviously have this striking weirdness of being human, but clearly not human.
What do we do about stuff that we don't know about? How do we keep an eye on this? You mentioned surveillance a few times there. How do we look for new stuff? Where are we looking for it?
That was exactly the case as Ebola. The research was done in the early 2000s. There was a vaccine preclinical candidates made, and that's why it went so fast when it came out, and the vaccine could then be progressed very quickly to a phase 1 and a phase 2 and so on. So the idea is then to fund research on this list of disease so that we prepare as much as we can vaccines that are ready, not commercialized, but then could be used in that situation before it gets out of control, let's say. So that's the preparedness plan.
Okay, so be prepared then.
Be prepared in terms of vaccines.
We can't stop globalization, but how can we mitigate its effects, maybe?
I think it's extremely difficult to mitigate the effects effectively. I mean, one thing that's interesting to look back to is the 1918-1919 flu pandemic, which killed more people than the First World War. Even in that case, it turned out that it was carried on ships across the Atlantic, and you saw it within a few months spreading across the world. And now we're so much more mobile. There's so many, whether sort of fruits, livestock, but also people travelling across. And I mean, you can have scanners at airports or do various things to try and check whether people have elevated temperature and so on. I think it can reduce the risk, but the likelihood of catching every case, and and if you have a sort of highly infectious disease, then even if a few cases get through, you can still start an epidemic, and if the conditions are right, it can still get out of control. So it's likely to give you a bit more time, or to more sort of create a bottleneck, which will mean that you've got more time to get things sorted out. But I think the likelihood of, as it were, keeping our sceptred isle pure from infectious disease by scanning people who's coming through the borders, it's probably a UKIP fantasy.
Principles then. So we have Ellie. She has an arm bite. Could bearing in mind what we know about this world, so let's assume there's not a great deal of science there, could we take a sample of tissue or something from her arm bite and use that to grow up a vaccine of some sort?
Not a chance.
No?
No.
One thing that really struck me when I was researching this a year or two ago is that if you really do have the massive pandemic, and then it's a question of, well, how do we vaccinate everyone? It turns out that there's one of the bottlenecks is the actual global capacity to manufacture enough vaccines. And I think that it seemed that part of the problem was that, well, it seems a bit of a waste of money to have all these vaccine factories doing nothing all the time. And then to gear up and actually to make, sometimes you might need 2 doses of vaccine, to make enough vaccine to vaccinate 7 billion people. It's not something that the world can do at the drop of a hat. How long would it take?
Takes a lot of time, and especially because several vaccines are made differently, so you need different types of plants of conditions to prepare the vaccine, to grow the vaccine. It depends if it's an attenuated or a killed whole bug, or whether it's a recombinant protein, or this is a totally different plant and a different approach. So normally, I'm a preclinical vaccine developer. I'm not working in private companies or pharma producing vaccine, but as much as I know, the plant is actually designed for the vaccine when the vaccine is coming through the pipeline. So plants are designed for specific vaccines very often. So let's say the new pandemic needs a type of vaccines where there's maybe 2 plants in the whole world because there's 2 pharma companies producing it. You're entirely right. There's no capacity at all to produce very quickly one vaccine for 7 billion people.
We've got her now. She's infected, but she's not
developing the disease.
Yeah,
that's still interesting on the point of view of
she's
prevention.
She's a case study, if nothing else.
Yeah.
So we take her to our resource poor but appropriate for the period research centre. How long would it take to develop something that they could inject into me to prevent me getting infected with the fungus?
So before you test your vaccine in human, can take, in the best case scenario, I'd say 2 years, and in the normal scenario, it's 5, 10 years.
10 years,
5.
potentially 10
If
years.
it's, well, look at HIV, for example. How long are we? 20 years?
Yeah, 20, 30
More?
years probably, yeah.
30 years, and we don't, well, we have things in clinical trials, but not a product. So it really depends on the complexity of the bug and the complexity of fighting it, or finding ways to fight it, and how the bug reacts to the fight. Some bugs just mutate. You have an antibody that blocks it, and then the next generation, it's mutated. So that is a very big deal. So typically we do say vaccine developers that if we're given a disease, it takes 10 years. 10 years is an optimistic.
I mean, do you think that maybe game makers should work more or work closer with scientists to ensure that at least there's a passing nod to what would really happen? I mean, in this case, you say in this case, maybe not, but even if they just said, "Oh, this, we're going to make this vaccine. It's going to take some time, but we're going to do it," would at least a nod towards realism. Do you think that would be important?
I think even more than a nod. I mean, it very much depends on the type of game you're making. Again, if you are making a kind of brainless sci-fi shooter, nobody is really playing that with science. If you're making something, and I think The Last of Us does have ambitions to be a kind of deeper game with deeper themes. I mean, obviously the themes here are more emotional. They're about the father-daughter bond. But it is a scenario where you can see it could present some of the ethical questions around vaccination and science.
What are the chances of this? Like, I mean, we've talked about infrastructure, we've talked about science, we've talked about vaccine development. Is this game though purely science fiction? I know it's an open-ended one; it's a difficult one to answer, to say yes or no. But are there pieces of it we could take out and learn from? What do we think?
Well, I'll hand over to the actual experts. The only thing I would say is that if there is a pandemic, the victims of it are more likely to be, dying rather than running at you.
It does seem to be that would be the case, yeah.
Well, anything's possible, isn't it? Who knows?
Okay.
Who knows?
All right. Maybe that's too much of a hypothetical question. But listen, thank you all so much for joining me today. Thank you at home for joining us as well. I've been Benjamin Thompson. We've been here at the Wellcome Trust. See you again soon. Thanks a lot.
So, is this everything you were hoping for?
It's got its ups and downs, but view, though.